Vlada, Verena, welcome on the podcast.
Good to see you, Filip.
Hi, Filip.
So both of you have been on the podcast before. We did an episode with Verena on sanctions, due diligence, and with Vlada, I think it was actually our second episode that historically on Integrity Insights that we did on disinformation in the Russian internet ecosystem. So I will keep this short. Vlada is our managing partner at Berlin Risk. Verena is director at Berlin Risk. And today we will be delving a little bit deeper into background checks. We did an episode a couple of months ago with Davids and Verena where we talked kind of theoretically about what background checks are and what type of cases we usually work on. And today we would like to kind of open up the case file, so to speak, and talk about, obviously in a very anonymized, sanitized way, about some cases, some interesting cases that we've historically worked on. So maybe just to set the scene, to kind of reiterate this, what kind of cases do we actually work on usually at Berlin Risk? Whoever wants to take this.
Oh, I mean, a variety of cases. They usually integrity due diligence reports for different clients, although I think we have discussed it before. We work a lot with development institutions, so a lot of our clients are development finance actors, so to speak. We look at companies, we look at individuals with the kind of overarching idea to understand if partnering with the subject of our investigation might result in reputational risk for our client. It's not always like this, because sometimes we're talking about different types of cases. We're talking about somebody looking to hire an individual, and they're looking into this person to ensure, again, that no reputational or any other damage is done to the company. Sometimes people would be buying a company. It doesn't have to be a development finance institution, could be a corporate client. And again, they would be looking into the company, but also into the people behind the company, because the company is always the people, either beneficial owners or management or both. So this is what we usually work with, the material we are asked to look into.
Okay, so I think this is quite clear. So we can get straight into this. Maybe I can ask you first if you can think of a case where the initial kind of picture was relatively clean, and then as you start, digging deeper into it, a completely different picture materialized.
I can start with a simple one. Something really kind of a little bit even basic and very mundane, but I think in the end it was quite important, because we were working for a German consumer goods company, and they were, I think, hiring a CEO of their office in Russia. And the company was involved in production of consumer goods. Doesn't really matter which ones at this point. And the candidate we looked at was very good candidate on paper. There was nothing that stood out, all the correct track record, right age, right education. But when we started looking into corporate affiliations, we realized that the individual continued to hold shares in a company that was the key competitor of our client. So it was kind of awkward if you're hiring somebody who is, I think he had around 26% of shares in the competitor company. And at least at that point, it didn't look like he was going to dispose of them. Now, we don't always know what happens in these cases, and we don't know if in this situation he was asked to dispose of the shares or he was disqualified from the running. But I think that finding was quite material for our client. That didn't have anything to do with development finance. It was a kind of corporate consumer. But on the exotic side of things, like Verena, I also have a case.
Can I ask you first about this shareholding?
Yeah, sure.
Was it easy to find that he held these 26% of shares in this company? And was it a direct shareholding, or was there a couple of, in between companies?
I believe it was not direct, which is why it didn't pop up immediately, because usually clients do a little bit of their kind of homework, a little bit of their internal due diligence, so to speak. And no, it was not direct, because if it has been direct, I think they would have been able to see it. So I cannot remember now whether we had 1 or 2 layers in between, but it was also not so hidden. And that was kind of surprising to me, that the individual was running for this job, because it wasn't, the individual was running for the job, and the individual actually, I believe, signed a form that allowed release of information on him. So he kind of should have known, but he didn't. Maybe he didn't think it was relevant. It definitely was relevant for the client.
Yeah, yeah. And sorry, what was the other case you wanted to mention, Vlada?
Oh, the other case was extremely exotic. So the client was based in Africa, and it was about an infrastructure project. I also find that infrastructure seems to be just written with this interesting cases, to say the least. So a company based in Hong Kong was going to invest $4 billion into infrastructure project in Africa, which is not a small amount of money. When we looked at the Hong Kong company, it did exist on paper, but it had individuals behind it whom we actually traced to Sri Lanka. So the company was registered in Hong Kong, but the directors and the shareholders, I'm not sure 100% now, but it was both, but they were based in Sri Lanka. When we started looking in Sri Lanka, in Colombo, we realized that the individuals in questions and the entities in questions that were supposedly shareholders of the Hong Kong company, they were based in a slum in Colombo. So, and we actually obtained a picture. It was a shack, it was really a slum. Now, the website of the Hong Kong company was written in an extremely illiterate English. So it was really it was outstanding how badly it was written. It nevertheless made astonishing claims about, multi-billion investments in all kinds of projects. None of these projects, when investigated, turned out to have been existing anywhere in the universe in the past. We also found that they claimed to have received investment from a Japanese investor. And there was a name of the investor. The name was not easy to trace because a lot of Japanese names tend to be similar. It was kind of very generic Japanese name. Nevertheless, the generic Japanese name was also attached, I think, to a certain geography. And there were other indicators that helped us to identify the person, and the person turned out to be actually a Yakuza in Japan. So we had somebody who was identified by Japanese source inquiries, including with law enforcement, as being a member of Yakuza. That person was supposed to be the investor of this incredible entity in Hong Kong that in the middle of our investigation, I should say 2/3 into investigation, the website disappeared altogether. It didn't exist anymore. So that was a pretty exotic case. So because that was, everything was fake about that. And we are talking about a claim, a bid for a $4 billion infrastructure project. So yeah, this happens.
It's fascinating. I find it interesting that you mentioned cases in Africa, and I also have some experience with Africa, seeing a particularly grave level of fraud. Why do you think this is specifically connected to Africa or consortiums approaching African governments?
The numbers, the volume of projects in Africa right now, it's the region to invest, yeah. So you have a very large number of projects. You have quite a lot of money involved because, actually the international financial institutions are putting a lot of money into Africa. So there is money to fight for. And yes, there is an assumption that the local partners, whether it's local governments or local corporations, will not be doing their due diligence. And maybe there is a bit of an arrogant view that people on the other end in African countries wouldn't care, wouldn't worry, would miss, this type of thing. And maybe a little bit kind of arrogant attitude, they wouldn't know. I don't know. But I certainly can say that I have never seen the number of projects and the sheer obnoxiousness of claims made in projects as high as in Africa. and various African countries. Probably less so in the North Africa, because I think it's a different dynamic there. So it's sub-Saharan Africa mostly, I think, in my experience.
Yeah. But speaking about obnoxious projects, specifically in connection to Africa, I also have one of my favorite in the sense that was just particularly obnoxious approach in a sub-Saharan African country where a company that was presenting itself as a construction group, like a large construction group, I can say it was a Turkish construction group, wanted to do some business with the African government, and we started looking into this construction group, and everything seemed fine on the surface. It had a bunch of projects listed, huge construction projects that it was involved in. But as we were doing the research in the Turkish corporate registry, we couldn't find the group. And then at some point we realized we couldn't even find like a single legal entity with this name. And then eventually it turned out that this was actually just a one-man operation. It was a sole proprietorship. And the individual was kind of like a hybrid in the sense that it wasn't a complete fraud, because this individual, he was actually involved in the project that he was presenting on the website as like projects completed by the group, but he worked on the projects as like an employee of other companies. So it was kind of like a hybrid. It was a misleading, I would say, communication on behalf of this individual. And also another interesting thing, the whole website of this group was the individual sections of the website were just copied and pasted from websites of some internationally active construction companies. So it was a very, very, as you use the word, Vlada, obnoxious, very kind of lazy, I would say, approach.
I remember reading this report. So yeah, it was quite obnoxious. And the interesting thing is that, as you said, the individual wasn't complete fraud. He was, I think, an engineer, and he did participate in those construction projects, except not in the role he claimed. And certainly he was never the owner or even the director of any of the companies that carried out those projects. So it was a little bit kind of, he did use his experience, but he misrepresented it absolutely grossly.
Yeah. I mean, Africa is always a fascinating territory for investigators. But if we were to stick a little bit closer to home, we are based in Central Europe, Germany. Can you maybe think of some cases a little bit closer to this geographical area?
I have one. It's interesting. We're talking about Africa, and there's a lot of misrepresentation. And this case was much more a case of obscuring the facts, I guess. It's more of a classic case, and it was one of the first ones I did for Berlin Risk. And it was probably I still talk about it because it was the most satisfying case in terms of a coming together of, deep dive research and human source inquiries. So it was several years ago, and we had a client that was a large commercial European bank, and they were eyeing up an investment in a number of funds in quite a small Central European jurisdiction. And these funds were the primary financing vehicles for a large property holding company that had kind of mainly premium real estate in Russia, but also Germany, Austria, so forth. Looked obviously a company that was making good money on property. And we were hired to undertake, I guess, a full-scale integrity due diligence with a bit of kind of regulatory research into, an assessment basically of the regulatory landscape for funds in this jurisdiction. So we started on our OSINT, and, our OSINT uncovered a fair few red flags to do with the fund managers, but there were sort of corruption claims and so forth, all sorts of interesting things. But there was one issue that really kind of stood out, which was that when we did our regulatory research, we came up with some interesting details, and that was namely that this jurisdiction hadn't, so long ago, introduced a UBO register, so a beneficial ownership register, because it was trying to get in line with, the European anti-money laundering regulation. So, the country brought in the register and had basically recently required certain types of investment funds to register their beneficial owners with this register. To state the obvious, there were some loopholes and it wasn't accessible to the public, but it meant obviously that the authorities would have access to this information. And the interesting fact was, when we looked into the funds around the time that this regulation had been introduced in this jurisdiction, the funds, all three of them, because there were three, had changed their legal structure to a type of funds that wasn't required to divulge beneficial ownership. So we were kind of like, okay, is this just a coincidence? In the brochures, the fund brochures, they gave some kind of justification around fund structure and how it was necessary. But we activated our sources on the ground in Russia. This was back when it was still possible to do source inquiries on the ground in Russia.
Still possible. We still do this.
True, but it's more difficult.
Yeah, it's more difficult.
It's much more difficult. In this case, when we undertook these inquiries, the results were pretty clear. Basically, we had multiple unconnected independent sources stating that it had been pretty widely known in the market that until recently kind of publicly discussed, that this property company that these funds were financing vehicles for were controlled by a very high profile and well-known associate of Vladimir Putin, who was obviously had been sanctioned since 2014, but was obviously still investing all over Europe. And actually, when we did further research, public records research, we found that there were still traces of connections between companies owned by this individual and this property company through kind of operational connections to various companies and individuals. So in the end, we were able to go to the client and give them altogether a pretty solid argument saying that, these funds were connected to a sanctioned individual and there's a clear legal and reputational risk associated with this. So that was pretty satisfying. I say that just, I think we've mentioned this before. Obviously, there's this funny tension in what we do between what is satisfying from our I think we all three come from journalism backgrounds. So there's what's satisfying from our investigative point of view, and obviously what the client wants to hear. And in this case, it unfortunately wasn't great news from their perspective.
Yeah, it is unfortunate that quite often our investigations result in concerns rather than relief. But that's because I think most of the cases that come our way are cases where the client feels that it is worth looking deeper. So we simply don't get that many easy cases, although, obviously quite a lot of the time, routine background checks on managers or they don't produce such exciting, so to speak, results, but they produce results that are actually more satisfying for the client in that context, right? The people are able to proceed with their plans when we can give them kind of comfort, confidence that this individual, this company will not represent an issue for them working with these people.
Yeah, and also needless to say, we in the vast majority of cases, we don't really know what the client ultimately decides. We have no control over this. But I can think of one case that I did some time ago, also in Central Europe, where there was also this satisfaction knowing that I think from our perspective, the client ultimately made the right decision. This is a major manufacturing company in one of the smaller Central European countries before an IPO. And our client wanted to invest relatively a lot of money into this company. It was doing really well. It was kind of all in the news, not just in this region in Central Europe, but all over the world or in the Anglo press. And we did some due diligence into the company. There was a couple of issues. There was a lot of political exposure in its home country, also some existing subsidiaries in Russia, Kazakhstan. But most importantly, there was an ongoing criminal police investigation in 2 Central European countries involving kind of the same things. It was allegations of bribery, corruption, and we kind of presented this report to the client, and they ultimately decided not to invest. And what I found particularly interesting, that after this, just a few weeks after we submitted our report, this independent Dutch media organization did their own investigation, and they found through some whistleblowers basically a similar kind of case, similar to what the police in these two Central European countries have been investigated, allegation of corruption, bribery in another European country. And also the company has been since then subject to attack by a lot of short sellers, which doesn't necessarily, prove that they are guilty of anything, but they had also some interesting findings. And the stock of the company since the IPO is still below 50% of the asking price. So I think this was ultimately like a good case to work on, knowing that the client ultimately made, I think, also financially sound decision.
But I think it's maybe another thing to say that it doesn't always, first of all, the cases are not always so dramatic, but also the other thing we can do, not just, prevent a bad thing happening, but maybe provide recommendations and find certain mitigants, mitigating factors. Because I do find that, in a lot of cases, you can find mitigating factors, or you can recommend certain steps that can make the deal, the transaction, the plan to still go ahead, provided certain conditions are met. And sometimes the counterparties, the subjects of investigations, are willing to make those steps in order to get the deal done. So it is actually possible to have this positive kind of influence on the situation, not simply by preventing very drastically reputationally bad things happening to the client, but also in a less kind of dramatic cases, finding a way to help the transaction, the deal, go ahead, but in a safer environment for the client. I think that also has to be said, that and that is also satisfying, actually, if you can do this.
Yeah, that's a good point. Sorry, Verena, you wanted to add something?
No, I was just saying, I think another good point is being able to contextualize these risks, being able to say, okay, this company or this organization has a historical case where it was involved, its UBO was involved in a dodgy privatization deal. I mean, these things happened, right? They happened, and it was fairly common for a period, for example, but it's being able to contextualize that risk and say, what does it mean for this company now? What does it mean for the investment now? And, how does it compare? How does this company or how does this subject compare to its peers? What kind of risks are still there in the market or politically even? What's the risk of this issue coming back to bite the client? Those kinds of things, I think contextualization is really important. And that's also quite a fun part of what we do, I think.
Yeah. I would like to wrap up this conversation. You have done, obviously, a lot of these due diligence background checks before. What would you say? Why does it matter? And what are the risks of not doing this at all and going to a deal or a potential partnership kind of blindly?
Our whole conversation was kind of about that. In a sense, the risks can be very serious. You can end up dealing with a fraudulent party. You can end up dealing with somebody who hasn't made their money in a decent way. So the origin of capital can be problematic. You can end up dealing with somebody who is politically exposed, all these things. And there are two aspects to it. One is regulatory, If you do this, especially if you didn't conduct your due diligence and you cannot present, to the regulator the evidence of you actually trying to make sure that things are fine. So A, you might be subject to regulatory measures, and B, it's your reputational on the fire, so to speak. Certain things, when they become public, like the case when you talked about, the Dutch media, it's a problem. It's a problem for your reputation. When you didn't do your due diligence, when you didn't look into your counterparty in advance, when you didn't identify those risks, you are in trouble. You're in trouble because your own reputation is jeopardized. That's just how it is.
I'm going to come at it from a more moral, ethical standpoint as well, because I agree with absolutely everything Vlada said. But from a moral, ethical standpoint, for example, the case with the sanctioned individual, do we want to be facilitating the proceeds of criminal behavior, and specifically, for example, supporting Putin's war in Ukraine? We don't. So we want to be closing those loopholes and making sure that our clients aren't investing in those kinds of individuals and helping them get richer.
Yeah.
That's very sorry. That's very.
No, it's important. It's important.
You asked why it matters, so I.
Well, this is a pretty strong argument, but I've really enjoyed this conversation. But now I have to work in another case, unfortunately. So I'll have to go.
Do you?
Yeah. Tight deadline. But thank you so much. Appreciate your time. I will see you soon in the office, hopefully.
Yep.
Thank you, Filip.
Thanks, Filip. Thanks, Vlada.